Gather round the fire, folks. I got some stories that'll really make your jaw drop. We're not talking about your run-of-the-mill ghost tales here. Nope. These are real-life nightmares cooked up by the justice system itself. The punishments in these cases are so out of whack, they'll have you wondering if the judges were hitting the marijuana brownies a little too hard, if you know what I mean. Life without parole for stealing a $159 jacket. First up, we have Timothy Jackson, a 36-year-old restaurant cook with a 6th grade education and a drug problem. One fateful day in 1996, he snatched a $159 jacket from a New Orleans department store. A moment of weakness, sure, but what happened next will chill you to the bone. The security guard was hot on his trail, so Timothy dropped the jacket and tried to make a break for it. But the long arm of the law had other plans. You see, Timothy had a rap sheet, a juvenile conviction for simple robbery and a couple burglary charges. And in the eyes of the Louisiana court, that made him a fourth-strike offender. Judge Burnett Johnson handed down a sentence that would make even the most hardened criminal weep. Life without parole. Can you imagine spending the rest of your days behind bars for a measly jacket worth $159? Life in prison for siphoning gasoline. Picture this, 2 18-wheelers parked side by side in a lonely lot in Pearl, Mississippi. A man named Philip Young, down on his luck, decided to siphon some free fuel for his rig. Desperate times, desperate measures, right? Well, the owner, Ricky Sherman, returned to find Young red-handed. Young panicked, jumped into his truck, and led the cops on a 40-minute chase before they finally slapped the cuffs on him. Now here's where things take an absolutely absurd turn. Young had a previous conviction for an unarmed carjacking where nobody was harmed. But in the eyes of the Mississippi District Court, that was a violent crime. And helping himself to a little fuel? Well, that was automobile theft in their book. Hold on to your seats, folks. For stealing some gasoline, Philip Young was sentenced to life in prison without parole under the habitual offender law. A man's entire life flushed away over a couple gallons of go juice. Life in prison for stealing tools. Next, let me introduce Patrick Matthews, a 17-year-old kid who in 2005 went on a little burglary spree while hopped up on meth. He hit a pawn shop, a fruit stand, the works. Pleaded guilty to 3 counts of simple burglary, got a 5-year suspended sentence. But the madness didn't stop there. In 2007, the court reopened that case, charging him with a 4th burglary count that got lost initially. Just like that, his first strike labeled him a 4-strike offender. Then in 2009, Matthews was accused of stealing some tools and equipment while riding with a friend. He claims he had no idea they were hot goods, but it didn't matter. The court treated him as a 5-time habitual offender and showed him the ultimate punishment: life in prison without parole for a non-violent crime at just 17 years old. Life for a forged $88 check. Our next tale, Paul Lewis Hayes, is one that'll make your head spin. This Kentucky man was indicted for uttering a forged instrument in the laughable amount of $88.30. A little financial oopsie. Nothing too crazy, right? Well, the prosecutor saw things differently. They offered Hayes a 5-year plea deal, but if he refused, they threatened to pursue harsh habitual criminal charges thanks to his 2 prior felonies. The prosecutor wouldn't make the court suffer the inconvenience of a trial. The prosecutor threatened to pursue a harsh habitual criminal charge if Hayes didn't take the deal. Well, Hayes called their bluff, and the court promptly shipped him off to live out his days in a cold, dark cell, all for an $88 bad check. Scientists jailed for failing to predict an earthquake. Let's take a trip across the pond to Italy, where 6 scientists found themselves facing a judge's gavel for one of the craziest reasons you've ever heard. In 2009, the town of La Aquila was rocked by a 6.3 magnitude earthquake that claimed over 300 lives. Tragic, yes, but the real crime happened 6 days before, when scientist Enzo Baschi looked at some small tremors and concluded a big one was unlikely. The government then told people not to evacuate. We all know predicting earthquakes is a crapshoot, but in the aftermath, Italian officials were desperate to point fingers. Their target? Those 6 scientists who never claimed to have a crystal ball. Yep, you guessed it. The Italian courts slammed them with convictions for involuntary manslaughter and 6-year prison sentences for failing to predict the quake. Can you imagine sending the experts to jail for not seeing into the future? Even once the utter insanity came to light, it took years to finally overturn that sham on appeal. 25 years for $15 a meth. Don't do drugs, kids. No, seriously. They'll mess you up good. And depending on your record, that little chemical vacation could hand you a life sentence. Just ask California inmate Shane Taylor, caught in the crosshairs of the state's draconian 3 strikes law. Taylor's first 2 strikes came from a couple of mid-'80s break-ins where he didn't even take anything worth value from one of the homes. 8 years later, cops find 0.14 grams of methamphetamine in his car. That's about $15 worth of crank. But thanks to those 2 decades-old prior strikes, Shane suddenly found himself going to bat as a third-time offender. The amount of meth didn't matter. It triggered the maximum automatic sentence. The judge, Howard Broadman, had no choice but to throw the book at Shane, handing him a life sentence that could keep him locked up for a quarter century or more, all for possessing $15 worth of meth. 1,000 lashes and 10 years for blogging. Now let me take you to the deserts of Saudi Arabia, where a blogger named Raif Badawi found himself in the crosshairs for one of the most outrageous punishments you've ever heard. His crime? Creating the Free Saudi Liberals website to foster dialogue about human rights and secularism. For that act of free expression, the Saudi government charged Raif with insulting Islam itself. In May 2014, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison and a staggering 1,000 lashes to be carried out 50 at a time every Friday. Can you imagine? A man whipped and flayed repeatedly for daring to exercise free speech on the internet. Even the prison doctors examined him and deemed him unfit for another lashing after the first few. But the Saudis insisted on carrying out this medieval act. Worse, they threatened to retry Raif for apostasy, a crime punishable by death. His wife and kids fled to Canada, but continue fighting for his release from this nightmare. 384,912 years for not delivering mail. But the prize for most absurd punishment goes to Gabriel March Grandos of Palma de Mallorca, Spain. This 22-year-old's crime? Failing to deliver 42,768 letters as a mail carrier. Strap yourselves in, because the Spanish judges showed no mercy. They handed down a 384,912-year sentence. That's right, over 380,000 years for delaying some mail. They imposed 9 years for each undelivered letter, landing him with the longest official prison sentence in recorded history. For comparison, American mail carrier William Morse got just 6 months for dumping around 45,000 letters to cut his route short. But Spain straight up lost its marbles on poor Gabriel. Over 380 millennia for late mail? That's enough to serve 1 billion life sentences. Spanish justice at its most unhinged and ridiculous. Well, folks, there you have it. A buffet of judicial insanity, minor crimes drawing massively disproportionate punishments from unchecked legal systems gone mad with power.